Hello everybody and welcome back. Thank you very much for joining me. My name is Deborah Hatswell and you're listening to BBR Investigations. Hello everybody and welcome back. My name is Deborah Hatswell. Thank you very much for joining me today while I share some of the case files from BBR Investigations. This week I braved the storms and we've been out to meet a witness with the Paranormal Film Unit team, and that witness has seen what he described as a wild human in his local woodland. We met up in the area of his sighting and he shared the strange things he'd found while walking there. And I'll be sharing those events with you at a later date, showing the interview, taking in the full scene. Stepping into the woods was like a visit back in time, and you could imagine living there as a early human. Lush cover, water sources, birds, fish, and wildlife everywhere. It wouldn't be too hard to understand why a human, connected to nature in the way we once were, would call this place home. When you're standing there in a setting like that, I remember all of the cases I've taken, where the person described what they saw as a wild person, a Neanderthal, or a caveman. And I have taken many of those reports over the years. But the first two cases we'll hear tonight are new and have never been spoken about publicly before, as they've only just come into BBR, and you'll be hearing them here for the first time. Our first report is called A Neanderthal Saved My Life, and this happened in 1998. It comes from a gentleman called Tim, and he says, "Hi Deb, I hope you're well. I contacted you as I just came across your YouTube channel. When I was watching one of your videos and you talk about the Wildman that's been seen many years ago, it resonated with me. I was in Kielder Forest with a youth team, and I ran away after an argument that I had. I ran into the forest and away from the log cabins I was staying in. As I was running, I was stopped dead in my tracks by something I saw. The only way to describe it is to say it looked like what I would call a Neanderthal type person. He had long hair covering his body everywhere. This honestly happened to me. I was around 12 or 13 years old at the time. It was in 98, close to 99 when it happened, and we were staying at Kielder Dam, which is in Northumberland. At the time, I played it down to an old homeless person, but it wasn't. It was something else entirely. I stopped for a split second as it happened. It was so fast, and just as I was going to run again, this thing grunted and made me go back the way I'd come. On returning to the area the next morning in daylight, I realised I was only a few metres from a cliff edge leading into the dam when he stopped me with his growl. He saved my life that day. He did mention this to the guide back at the cabins, and he played it down to just being my imagination, but it wasn't, honestly. I saw a wild man that day. I'm nearly 40, and it's still fresh in my mind as much as it was then. There's something out there for sure. Since then, I've always been intrigued by Bigfoot, but it wasn't a Bigfoot. It was more human in the face form, from what I could make out. I was always tall as a kid. I'm 6'3" now, and I was tall then. I was definitely taller than it, but it was fatter than me, with bigger arms and legs. It wasn't aggressive at all. I truly believed it helped me that day and stopped me going over the cliff. Now, if you've been to Kielder, Deb, you'll know it's remote, and anything could have happened to me out there. I just thought I'd let you know my story. Now, thank you, Tim, because I know a number of other witnesses who've had experiences similar at Kielder Forest. One was wild campers, Steve Butler. Many of you know Steve, and he said a few months back, Deb, in 2017, I decided I'd do a stealth motorbike camp up near Kielder Forest. No, nothing fancy, just a tarp and a bivvy for cover. I settled in for the night. About midnight, I heard something moving around. I wasn't mistaken. Something large was crashing around me in the undergrowth. Every time I shone a light in that direction, the crashing sound stopped. I'll be honest, I was scared. It didn't put me off camping, but I'm going to be more wary from now on. I decided I'd do another night camp the other week in the same area, up near Kielder Water. Just as wild as last time, but wild enough. I was in the same spot I used last time when I heard the same crashing sounds. As the evening went on, thankfully nothing happened. I settled down, expecting to sleep until morning. Then around 3 a.m, I was woken by my tarp being dragged off the roof of my tent. Something or someone had pulled my tarp right off the roof. It was still night, there was no wind to speak of, no reason for the tarp to come off. I tied it the way I always do. It never happened before, even in bad weather. It scared the crap out of me. I didn't want to move, but I needed to make a call on nature, and I was going to have to go out there. Standing there in the misty gloom with my head torch on, I caught a pair of eyes about 50 feet away. I thought it was just a fox or a cat, but then the eyes started to come closer to me, which is unusual behaviour for a fox or a cat. I jumped back in my bivvy, tried to get some sleep. It wasn't easy, but I managed in the end. I've been in the peaks loads of times, but I've never been as scared as I was that night. There's also an account from a paranormal team in Kielder who had an investigation disturbed by rocks being thrown at them. They heard loud tree knocks and bangs from the woods, and when they eventually had enough, the team leader saw a tall, hairy figure walking away from them in the darkness. In our next case, we hear about a wild woman as averse to a wild man, and that's very rare indeed. This case took place in the Ukraine during World War II and was shared with me by the daughter of a man who served there when he was a young man, stationed there in the German army. Our witness's name is Lightning Spirit, and she said, "My father saw one of those wild people when he was in the forest in the Ukraine. He was in the German army during World War II when he saw her. He said the wild woman was quite nearby to him. He could see her clearly, and she seemed to be watching him silently. My father said it looked like a woman, but a wild woman with primitive-looking face, and that face was framed in hair. She was naked and had hair scattered all over her mid-brown skin, and he remembered that she smelt. He said years later he was watching a TV programme about native Papuans, and that the face of the wild thing he saw reminded him somewhat of its face. He said at the time he thought it must be some kind of crazy wild human living out there in the forest, but not a Ukrainian person, a wild person. Now, there's a history of wild humans all across Europe. Whether they're called wild folk, leshy, almaster, they're accepted there as part of the natural way of things. Not like in the UK, where you have to fight a million battles just to prove you saw something that defies logic. One of my favourite stories from Europe is one I came across many years ago now. It's shared with me by a fellow investigator who lived in Norway at the time. I've never forgotten it, and I wonder if they're still out there, going about daily life as they always have. We start the story with a man who shares his grandfather's experience with a strange red-headed cave people that he met many years ago. Now, knowing my Basque heritage makes it very special to me. The Valley of Neanderthals. This was posted by Bigfoot researcher David Clare, and he said, Lucy and Camille Clare was my grandfather, and he was born in the mid-1800s in Alsace in Lorraine. His village was located in the portion of the Alps north of the region that borders France, Germany and Italy. The Alps have many moderate to large mountain peaks that surround the secluded alpine valleys where the villages would be. My grandfather lived in a small village in one such valley. The villagers were hardy mountain shepherds, farming the lower slopes and grazing livestock in the mountain pastures. Lucian learned mountaineering arts at an early age, and when he was an adult, he explored the Alps during the summer months. With a bedroll and a backpack, he travelled for many miles around, climbing the summits and visiting remote villages. Often he would offer to work for food or shelter, or sometimes a small sum of money. He related this story to me in an adventure he had near the borders of France and Italy. Situated in the heart of the Alps, the mountain ranges on the borders of these countries are some of the most inaccessible in Europe. One day, deep in the interior, he happened across an isolated village that was peculiar in many respects. The first thing he noticed was that the building construction was very different from most that he'd seen in Europe. They had thatched houses and barns, but the supports were made out of hewn trunks with some of the big branches left on the trees, and those branches formed the arches that supported the ceiling beams. The men of the village were all burly, barrel-chested, bushy hair and coarse-featured, with enormous ginger beards. Many of the men also had red hair and blue or greenish eyes. They wore leather breeches and homespun shirts. They seemed to be staying indoors, and he didn't see any of them for the first few days. The children seemed very shy and either peeked around the corners of the houses or darted away swiftly. The men spoke with an unusual accent, and he couldn't understand some of them at all, although he spoke both French and German fluently. But one of the men could speak fragmented bits of both languages with a bit of a smattering of Italian, and using many hand gestures kind of befriended him. He offered my grandfather food and lodgings in his barn in return for helping to build an irrigation sluice. They fashioned the sluice from halves of hollowed-out logs joined end to end, and my grandfather was good with an axe, and after a week of solid labour, the man complimented him on his skilful work. He invited him to dinner at his house, suggesting that he introduce him to his daughter. On the appointed evening, he went to their house, and when dinner was served, the daughter came out of the kitchen carrying a tray of food. Lucian was shocked to see that her bare arms were totally covered with the same thick woolly hair that her father and the other village men had on theirs, and that she seemed to have bushy sideburns under her long shaggy hair. When she leaned forward to set down the tray, you could see that she had more hair on her chest than he did. He was so disturbed that he had to fight to swallow down the food. After the meal, the men retired to the porch to smoke pipes. Lucian's host invited him to sleep in the house that night. Lucian accepted, but found himself unable to sleep. Lying there half awake for the night, he found he was tossing and turning in his bunk. He remembered hearing stories about rural customs that required a man to be married to a young woman, and after staying at her house for a single night. In a fit, he finally got up, and as quietly as possible he left the house. He went to the barn, hurriedly picked up his belongings. Unfortunately, the night was brightly lit by the moon, so he hastily hiked out of the valley, travelling many miles before even stopping a moment's rest. He said, "Recently, I was reading about the successful sequencing of the Neanderthal genome. Consequent to the gene mapping, DNA sequences specific to Neanderthals were also found to be present in the DNA of modern Europeans, comprising about 3% of the genome. It's also determined that some Neanderthals had the genetic makeup for red hair and blue eyes." I then remembered my grandfather's story, which I'd always thought of as quaint and an amusing tale, but nothing important. But his description of the people and of that remote village could easily fit a geographically isolated population of human Neanderthal hybrids who had only infrequent contact with outsiders before the 20th century. I would love to find this village and see the people for myself, but I'd keep their secret safe so they could live, as they have, quite peacefully, for millennia to come. I too would love to find that village and sit down with these wonderful ginger people and ask them about their culture, how they live, how they go about daily things. If wishes were horseshoes, we'd all be rich, wouldn't we? But I've taken many reports from across Europe, as have many reputable investigators and researchers from across the globe. One of them is Kelly Shaw from the Rocky Mountain Sasquatch Organisation. And I was very lucky that he had a report coming from Germany, and Kelly allowed me to share that case. It came in from a man named Tom, who lives in the north of Germany. Now, what you've got to understand is Kelly's having to translate this from German with no working knowledge of the language. Knowing a little German myself, I did make some changes to the grammar. But other than that, the report is in Tom's own words, and he said, "Help. I live in the East Holstein region of Germany. I was just out in a local bog that I think may be home of the Bigfoot creatures. I've pursued one of them for a long time now. I was in the bogland walking through after a while, and I heard a whistle. I went in search of that whistle, and I saw this thing, and it came running out of the trees, and it ran up to me. I do not know where to report this incident or who to tell. There's nobody in Germany. I watched the thing for about 2 seconds. It had long, matted black fur, like a dead animal, and big eyes and huge hands, and was around, say, 190 metres, up to about 210. It had its own features, and the face was without fur, and it had a disgusting stink. I did not like the stench, and it was a bad animal smell. It smelled like a rotting carcass or something dead. The creature as a whole looked somewhat like that of a Neanderthal man. I don't really know how to describe it. I ran up to my dirt bike and got away as fast as I could, and a terrible noise followed me as I left there. The only other strange find was a 2 by 2 metre large nest made of reeds and grass that looked like a large animal had made a bed there. Kelly said Tom's an avid outdoorsman who does a lot of fishing, and this encounter has scared him, and it sounds like he doesn't want to return to that part of the bog where his creature saw him, Deb. If we get any more information on this sighting, I'll make sure to post the updates to you. Now, this is not the only Bigfoot or Wildman account to come out of Germany. There's also the case of 4 mountain bikers who saw an upright walking bear in Falkenberg in 2012, and an account from an American tourist who gave a Wildman they saw a candy bar and was reported to have said, well, we just presumed it was like Bigfoot, like the ones you see back home. A man in eastern Finland says he saw 2 hairy-looking humanoids on his own land. The man was cutting firewood next to his house when he came upon the 2 strange beings on the 21st of December 2017, and he said, I live in a relatively secluded area, with the nearest neighbour living kilometres away. The weather was dry and cold, well below freezing temperatures, and there was already a large layer of snow on the ground. After firing up the stove in his sauna, he went back inside the house to have a snack, and he said, when I checked through the window if the smoke was still coming from the sauna's chimney, I noticed 2 vaguely humanoid figures exiting the sauna, leaving the door open and walking off into the woods. The 2 creatures were big humanoids. They were walking in a kind of hunched posture. After that, I lost sight of the figures in the woods. I checked the sauna, and it had warmed already pretty well. It was only that the door had been left open, letting the warmth out. I produced an electric torch from the anteroom of the sauna, and with its light, I saw that the unexpected visitors had left brownish coarse hair around. I was able to observe a few footprints, and the creatures were barefoot. It was hard to imagine. You'd be out there in the snow, in the coming dark, with nothing on your feet. They looked like humans, only much, much larger. A woman in Portugal spotted 2 similar figures that looked like primitive men way back in 1939. She was 83 when she shared her account, and she said when her and her sister were caring for a herd of cows on her father's land, they spotted 2 primitive men. And she said, I was 5 years old, and my sister was 8. We were in a remote area of the Sierra del Estral when we saw 2 naked men speaking a totally strange language, and then we saw them enter a cave. The following day, we decided to check out that cave with our sheepdog. But when we reached the cave, our dog didn't want to go in. He kept growling, and my sister wanted to go back. We could smell smoke, and that appeared to come from inside the cave. Later that day, when we told our father about the incident, he became angry. He told us he already knew about the existence of these people. He said they were the original people who survived in a few numbers and were still living in a primitive state in the wild. I remember him saying that there were only about half a dozen of them left and to leave them alone. The wild people were naked and had an almost yellowy tinge to their skin. In 2015, a man in North Carolina reported to have seen a 10 feet tall Neanderthal. Now, Neanderthals are known for being short, but we don't know everything. There's a lot of experts out there who'll tell you, how tall an individual was from one bone finger from a bone. So we only have the skeletons that we have. That's the only knowledge we have on Neanderthals. Bernard Tillman shared that he was with his dog in Kings Mountain, North Carolina in November of 2015 when he came across the creature. He said, I was taking our dog for his daily ride at 6 p.m. We were all approaching a small creek on the downgrade of the road, and I was looking at a 4-foot sapling, and they'd all been cut down. I believe the unidentified being didn't see me, He didn't see the dog coming down the embankment either. There he stood. It must have surprised him, because he was just standing really still. The sun was settling between him and me. It was only a 30-second encounter, but I described the creature as a 10-foot-tall humanoid walking on 2 legs. He was huge. He was massive in the chest and on his back. His hair looked black, and from a side profile, his neck, his head, his nose and his lower jaw looked like a Neanderthal. Now, I'd love to take you back to the UK, to the northeast coast, and an area called Tamfield. And it was here that a young girl saw a horrifying wild man sitting in a tree holding a bone tool of some kind. And her name was Karen, and she said, "I was hoping you can help me, as a strange experience I had as a child that I'd like to share. I'm hoping to shed some light on what happened to me that day, and get some help in working out what he was. I was somewhere between 5 and 7 years old, and I was in the local woods in Stanley, County Durham. I was with some older children, just playing out as children do. There was a group of us playing in the woods, climbing trees and making all kinds of noise. The girls I was with were about 13 years old, and nice, sensible girls, so my parents allowed me to tag along with them whenever I got the chance. Where I lived back then was an ordinary house in an ordinary town in the northeast of England. There were lots of fields and woods to explore. It wasn't remote or dense in any sense of the word. It was an average town, really, with surrounding countryside and greenbelt land, lots of small woods and streams scattered about. From what I can remember, we were playing in a clearing, and I think there may have been a rope swing attached to the tree. We were all playing. For some reason, I looked up into the tree, and high in the branches, I could see a really strange man, and he was crouched down, and he was holding a knife in one of his hands. He wasn't like a normal man. He was just out of place, not a tramp or a boy playing tricks. Of course, all this I reasoned afterwards. The man I saw, the one I was looking up at, I called him an ape man or a monkey man, as there were no other words to describe him. He reminded me of a caveman or a wild man who lived out in the wilds his whole life. I can't remember a lot of details about his appearance after 30 years or so. He had long, bushy hair and wore no clothes at all. In a panic, I pointed him out to the girls that were with me, and they looked up, but they said no one was there. I ran from the woods crying in fear, with the girls chasing after me, trying to catch up to me and calm me down. They always insisted no one was there, which you think would explain the whole thing away. But the fact that only I could see him in a way was worse. I was hoping they'd say it was just someone dressed up, or playing a prank to explain why he was there, but they never did. That really worried me over the years, and on occasion you question yourself harder than any skeptic would. I was constantly trying to understand all these things, hoping all of a sudden some tiny thought would give way to, now I understand. But that never came. And even to this day, my husband and family buy me monkey gifts or toys. I've never hidden this from anyone. This experience is part of me, part of my story, and one of the reasons I'm me. It's my story of a terrifying sighting of a hairy man who looked like a monkey with a knife gripped tightly in his hand. I could see him as clearly as he could see me. He wasn't like a Bigfoot or what I'd imagined they would look like, but he wasn't a normal man either. I know for sure I definitely saw him that day, and it frightened me to think the girls I was with couldn't see him, and that there's no explanation of who or what he is. That must have been so hard for Karen, especially only being 6 or 7 years of age. Trying to navigate the world at that age, quite scary anyway, isn't it? But to have seen something like that up in a tree, holding a bone tool in his hand, must have been awful. I can't imagine what that was like for her. I'm going to end tonight with one of the cases I hold closest to my heart, an account I received many years ago now, and sadly the witness who made it's now passed on. He and his Lily are back together again. I share this report on behalf of Derek, a man who helped me become me, and a man I miss dearly every day. And Derek said, "It's funny how me and you met, Deb. My wife never had an interest in CB radio, She'd spend hours each day going back and forth to the garden, off into the woods. She'd talk about the caretakers. In the beginning, I thought she meant actual caretakers. So you can imagine, I didn't understand that, not being from the country. Why did we have caretakers? Who paid them? Was it just a country thing? And my wife didn't understand my interest in radio, and transmitters and receivers. We met in her early teens. I was away in the army for most of our first decade. The wife lived here with her mum back then. And when her mum passed, we took over the house. My wife's family have farmed here close to the River Medway for hundreds of years. When I first moved into the farmhouse, I'll be honest, I didn't really take to it. It's in the middle of nowhere, and there was not much happening. I'm from the north of England, and I was used to cobbled streets and terraced houses. It was a good 5-mile walk to the village, and I only had one pub. But we managed somehow, and I was away for most of the early years, unless I was on leave. So the army's where I learned to fix and make radios, and it was doing that at night in one of the outbuildings, which stopped me packing up and moving us out of the area years ago. It was my stopping out. Of course, I'm in my 70s. I've spent many enjoyable decades growing old here, and in the last 11 years since my wife passed, I've been alone. I say alone, but I'm not the only widower on this property. I'll try and make this as short as I can for now. As you know, it's taken me a few years to come to terms with this, and so much has happened. But I'm not the one for writing, as you know. It's much easier over the radio or on the phone. Almost every day, my wife would leave half the eggs the chickens laid for the caretakers. If the bush is fruited and she went picking, she'd only ever bring half home. Everything on the farm was used to its nth degree. So I couldn't understand her leaving food like that. She stretched a penny well, did my wife, Lily. But in this respect, she would suddenly say, "No, you have to leave those for the caretakers." Over the years, I learnt to fish. It was my second favourite hobby. But if I caught anything, my wife would split what we had and take half into the woods. And this really started to get on my wick. One day, about 4 years after I'd left the army, I asked her who the caretakers were. Who employed them? No, did we pay them? And she looked at me like I had 3 heads, and she said, "Can't you see them?" I was dumbstruck. I said, "What? Here? Now?" I said in utter disbelief. But she said, "No," like I was a child. "When you're out on the land, when you're fishing, don't you see them?" And I had to admit that I hadn't. And she seemed genuinely upset by this. I was a bit disturbed to see her upset about some man who coppiced a few trees and kept the weeds down. What she told me next blew my mind. She explained that there were other families that shared the land. They lived wild in the woods and fished in the river with their hands. They were a large group, and they lived spread out over the woods, a few in each family group. One group lived just after our pond, and that's the reason that we left, We never used that stream at the bottom of the spill. I asked her if she meant tinkers, travellers or homeless folk from the bombings, and she said no. And she went on to explain that they were like cave people or really clever apes. I was utterly shocked. My wife said she'd always known about them, that her mother and grandparents did too. The farm had never failed. Year in, year out, they did fine. And they were convinced that this was because they shared the food with the other families. The granddad would be left brightly coloured feathers if one of his prize ducks was taken. He was grateful for the gift, but not so happy about his ducks going missing. I thought she was having me on. I didn't feel like being played for an idiot. And she was adamant and said if I went with her now, she'd show me. So I did. I called her bluff. We went into the woods just after the pond, and my wife waited and waited, and nothing happened. She was talking out loud and explaining it was okay, as if she thought something would hear her and come out. I was truly worried about her sanity. I then dropped a clanger. I put my hand to my forehead, like to do if you check if someone's ill, and she completely lost her temper with me. We had a huge row that night, worse than any row we'd ever had before or since. She was so upset for days and days after that we formed a truce and just said we wouldn't discuss it again. She went back to the woods each day, and I ignored it. Years went by. We had kids and grandkids, and there'd be the odd talk of hairy goblins or furry kids, and my wife would hush them up and change the subject when I was around. And then we ran out of time. In May, we found out my wife was sick, and by December, I was alone. I had the kids and the grandkids, of course, but for the first time ever, I felt truly alone. Returning from the hospice to that empty house was the worst journey of my life, and for days I didn't leave my bed. The house was a tip, and the outside didn't even enter my head. I stayed in that stupor for weeks. Drinking seemed to help me sleep, and anger and loss filled my hours. Until one day, about 9 years ago, everything changed that day for me. I just have had no way of voicing or sharing it in the intervening years, until you convinced me that people would understand. It took me a few years to adapt to this new routine. I knew my wife would be upset if I let the house go to rack and ruin, and she loved a garden, so I used that to fill my time. One day I was down at the brook, unclogging a pipe after heavy rain caused floods, when I saw, out the corner of my eye, something run past the side of the house. I thought it was someone trying to rob me, although how they'd get out there without a car was beyond me. I shot across the field up to the house, and no one was there. I took my boots off and crept in and walked softly around the house. Nothing. No one. I was flummoxed. I made myself a cuppa before heading back to the pipe. As I'm sitting there, warming myself next to the Argo, I suddenly see the shadow past the window again. I jump up and look. I slide in my socks and I take a fall onto the flagstones. I made a right mess of myself, but I did manage to get to the window just in time to see the bare end of what I presume was a teenager move under the hedge and promptly run off into the woods. I could see him, as clear as day. I didn't know where to look. I was so confused. He looked like a gangly teenage boy, all elbows and knees and stick thin. But he was naked and really hairy. I didn't see his face, just the back of him as he made off. Now all these years on, I know he was one of many. And it started with him, but then I'd see them more and more, as if they were getting bolder or more used to me. I'm not sure. I'd be fishing and catch one peeking round a tree at me, or I'd see them suddenly run across the track. I'd watch them through the window at night as I'd sit in the dark listening to my shows on the radio or chatting with other radio enthusiasts. As the years went on, I got used to it. We became used to each other. I started to recognise each individual. For instance, there was a huge male. He was old and grey, and what I assumed was his wife. A number of others were there, varying in ages, and every now and again one would leave, or a female would join them, and more young ones would appear. They look very human, but also like animals at the same time. They have hair everywhere, but only the old males have it on their face. The young are far less hairy. They're curious and really good at vanishing in front of your eyes, just using the light against you. I can't believe I'm sharing this with someone who looks at me with understanding, Deb. How do you do what you do? Over the years, I've always wanted to broach the subject with the kids. I just can't bring myself to do it. I still feel guilty about that row me and Lily had, and how upset my wife was. She must have felt so betrayed by me that night for not believing her, and betrayed by her hairy friends for not showing themselves. We could have spent a lifetime enjoying them together. Instead, I turned it into a dirty secret for her. I don't know how to discuss that with the kids. So for now, I just keep it to myself. I'm clocking on now, Deb, and the daughter's offered to move here and help me around the house. It'd be nice to have family around me for the last few years, so I suppose it'll crop up when she moves in. Update. I saw the old grey one today, Deb, and he was alone, for the first time ever. And it suddenly struck me. I hadn't seen his wife for a few weeks. I just put it down to the weather. Thinking about it, I haven't seen any of them for a few weeks now. I felt something deep inside as I watched him, standing there alone. I think he'd returned from somewhere. Did they go somewhere when one of them dies? I couldn't put a name to him or his species, but I recognise the loss of a loved one when I see it. I had an old tray burl that's been polished by the weather. I intended it for the house. but I put it next to the pond where I'd see his female companion picking rushes over the years, so the old chap had somewhere to sit and remember her, as I did for my Lily. Thanks for tonight, Deb. I think for the first time in years, I feel like I've let out some feelings that were crippling me inside. One day when I'm ready, I'll share this and all of this with the people. But for now, I'm okay if you just share this letter. Take care, Deb. I read that in remembrance of Derek Rendell. And Derek Rendell was one hell of a man and taught me how to be me. I wish I could share everything else with you, and I can't because it's Derek's story and it's up to Derek, isn't it? And I'm not in touch with his daughter, so I don't know what to do now. I really don't know. I've just had one quick email letting me know that he'd passed on. So if you're out there, Derek, and you hear me, just know that I love you and you will always have a special place in my heart, like Fred and all the rest of the witnesses that I speak to. Each case that I do takes a tiny little part of me that I leave behind, but I also bring a tiny little piece of them home with me. Now I have to accept his loss, because grief and death isn't just the end of life. It's part of life. It's part of the process. And I'm just glad that I helped him in a time of need. And I feel like that about every single one of the witnesses that I help. Derek once asked me, "How do you do what you do, Deb?" And I told him the truth. I don't know, Derek. I don't know any other way to be. Thank you for joining me today, and I hope you'll join me for future episodes. I release content like this every week, and I'm sure I'll cover a topic you enjoy, so don't miss out. Hit that follow or like button. Please check out my YouTube and Patreon memberships for early or exclusive content, and you can find the link to them and my social media and donation sites in one handy link tree below. BBR is not funded, so any donation, no matter how small, is highly appreciated. So I will bid you adieu, and I will be back at the same time, the same day, with more from the BBR case files.